So thank you, that was a fabulous start. Now, I'm going to ask Theo Hobson if you'd like to come up. Theo is an author and theologian. He's going to talk to us a bit about, we're often told that this has all been done in the name of unity, and Theo's going to give his thoughts about that.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. I'd like to thank Martine and the committee for inviting me to speak today. In a way, I'm a little bit surprised to find myself doing so. Until quite recently, I'd say it wasn't really my scene. My motivation for getting involved in this is slightly different from that of most of you, I think, but I hope my rather different perspective will be helpful. So let me say a few words about how my interest in the issue grew. At first, growing up, it didn't feel very relevant to me. I was a student, actually, at the time of first ordination vote. I was vaguely liberal, but the campaign for fuller inclusion and women bishops seemed to me to echo the various campaigns for equality in the wider culture, which weren't really my business. I was vaguely aware of the act of synod, which seemed a bit odd, but I didn't lose sleep over it. Surely those clever bishops and theologians knew what they were doing, right? Then I became a bit more interested in the issue, partly in a spirit of journalistic detachment and also fascination, almost like fascination at a car crash, at the church politics involved. One of my local churches was and is traditionalist, and I went along to see what I thought. Most of the small congregation seemed unaware of the affiliation, and it felt wrong that the parish priest was choosing this narrow identity, cutting his parish off from mainstream liberal opinion. And I looked again at the wider issue and wrote an article that included some thoughts on Watch. This was in 2018, before Martine was chair, by the way. And the previous chair seemed a bit on the fence about Watch's policy. She objected to the fact that women's ordination still had a provisional feel, of course, but she did not contest the declaration. She talked about mutual flourishing through gritted teeth, of course, but more or less affirmed it as the Anglican way. And it seems that Watch has almost always been in a dilemma about what to do about the rules. When Watch was founded, I think there was another group, GRAS, the Group for Rescinding the Act of Synod, which was a bit more practical and radical about changing it. And when the Act of Synod was replaced by the Declaration in 2014, in my understanding, it seems that no new version of that sort of campaign emerged, and Watch was left a bit on the fence. And this dilemma about what attitude to take to the Declaration is perfectly understandable. Rules in the church matter. Contesting them is quite a big deal. Also, there's a kind of psychological dilemma involved, which I'm sure all of you are very aware of. In a sense, it feels like the rules have cornered women into being trapped into certain sexist tropes we've had sort of described already by Rose, in a sense that women are seen as complaining ineffectually or nagging, or otherwise, what are they going to do? Try and bring the whole thing down and be sort of harridans. So it's sort of two forms of sexist trope in a way that women have been cornered into, I think. And then I wrote about the issue again just over a year ago and met Martine, and she was a bit less sanguine than her predecessor. Maybe Watch does have to change its position, she said, admit it wants the arrangement to be revisited, and as we've heard, that is Watch's policy. And by this time, there was a new reason to question the logic of alternative episcopal oversight. The LLF debate was causing conservative evangelicals to demand the same thing, and of course it's still going on. On one level, the depth of the division over homosexuality makes this seem a sensible solution, maybe the only possible one. But of course, many argue that If another structural division is brought into the church is basically finished. And in fact, as you surely know, Bishop Rose was articulating this powerfully last summer in the Synod. Until this point, I hadn't really looked very closely at the Declaration and the 5 guiding principles. And when I did, I was struck by the logical contradiction, of course, but also something else. Okay. It felt sort of sinister, in a way, that the church wanted to shut down debate, delegitimize the obvious theological objection, that a church needs a united authority structure, that division is a bad thing. So in a way, that's what sort of got me involved, just that rather sort of conceptual thing about church in unity. I met Martine again and then shared some thoughts at a Watch committee meeting. I expressed my misgivings about Watch's approach, that it foregrounds the language of rights and equality, but such language doesn't really work in this context. And I suggested that instead we should speak of the need for unity in the church as the priority of our rhetoric. We should call for the declaration to be revisited on the grounds that it goes against the unity of the episcopate, and Watch should explicitly come out against the declaration instead of saying that it's just opposed to interpretations of it that promote discrimination. And by emphasizing unity rather than rights, I suggested it could take the theological high ground. I had a sympathetic response, rather to my surprise actually, but I still doubted that Watch would speak against the declaration, because to do so is a major form of dissent, as I've said. The declaration is not just official church policy, it's become quite central. New priests have to sign up to it. To contest it is seen as a violation of good Anglican behavior. So I was pleasantly surprised when Watch did move in that direction at the end of last year. As you've heard, Martine says it's time to seek a generous end to the current arrangement. Perhaps this was partly influenced by the LLF debate, as I've said, and maybe it was partly influenced by a survey in the Times that found that 2/3 of clergy wanted the arrangement to end. Perhaps some of you didn't even know about this change of policy. I think the announcement got not very much attention, maybe because it was made quite cautiously, maybe because the media are not very attuned to hearing about this sort of thing. So there's a challenge of how to articulate this. And so I think the task is to say it louder and clearer. The problem is, in a sense, that Watch has been half saying it for years. So if we're really changing our approach, we have to find ways of getting heard. So in the time remaining, I just want to clarify my position that this sort of challenge to the declaration is needed. If the challenge is not made in fundamental theological terms, it will have an air of incoherence and also of secularism. That's why I had mixed feelings about Watch for some time. The complaints about injustice seem to play into the hands of the traditionalists, in a sense. They can say, oh, look how the liberals rely on the secular feminist rhetoric of rights, and fail to see that this is a special theological context. For example, when Philip North was appointed to Sheffield, Watch insisted that women clergy should have the right to serve under a diocesan bishop who fully affirms their ordination. But strictly speaking, rights have been defined differently by the declaration, and women clergy do not have such a right. You may say that the right to gender equality has priority over this frail bureaucratic compromise of the church. But that might not be a very helpful thing to say, for it seems to put secular assumptions before religious ones. It shows a preference for the secular over the Anglican understanding of this issue, which means that in a sense one has to go deeper, more basic. The declaration must be contested on the grounds that it is bad theology, in particular bad ecclesiology. And let's be honest, this is a serious step. The stakes are high. As I said, rules matter, and contesting them puts one in a rather complicated position. Also, frankly, it's a big step because of the aggression involved against the other side. It does mean seeking to deprive the traditionalist minority of its protections. Some might say the stakes are high because the Church has agreed to the ordination of women on these terms. The legitimacy of a female priest is linked to this arrangement, so if you contest it, you contest female ordination. Fortunately, that's not quite true. The ordination of women was passed, as you doubtless know, in 92 with moderate protections for traditionalists, and only the next year were these expanded. But still, the stakes are high if we do really try to contest these rules. So why is it worth doing? The average liberal says, don't go there. Yes, the Declaration is the biggest fudge in ecclesiastical history, and it's theological and logical nonsense, but it doesn't matter too much. A bit like we heard about the bar that didn't serve women. It doesn't matter too much. The traditionalists are fading away. They're a small minority and pretty harmless. But the harm is hard to quantify, quite apart from the difficulties that women priests have suffered and continue to suffer. Maybe the liberal mainstream has been demoralized, and maybe the idea of alternative episcopal oversight has spread from this issue to another, i.e. the gay issue, with a larger dissenting minority. So maybe you can't introduce bad theology because it's diplomatically convenient and get away with it. So we have to articulate what is the precise theological error that we think is made in the Declaration. It says or implies that a church does not need unity. The Act of Synod introduced the idea of two integrities, and there was a sort of groupthink pretense that this was somehow coherent and also virtuous and enlightened. Why did almost no one speak up for the unity of the church? Partly because unity was Anglo-Catholic rhetoric, and liberals felt awkward about using this rhetoric against those who used to own it. It seemed almost impolite to point out the contradiction, that despite claiming to have a high ecclesiology, they were now arguing for bishops' authority to be diluted. As a result, the church fell out of the habit of thinking that its unity mattered. To prioritize the concept of unity now felt aggressive, as if one wanted to curtail the rights of traditionalists. Also, the situation required liberals to stand up for the unity of the church, and they weren't in the habit of doing so. More widely, liberal theology lacked confidence. All the energy was with less liberal, more countercultural forms of religion and theology, a sort of major trend that we've seen for a generation now. So we're really trying to contest quite a sort of profound theological climate, in a sense. And I think our motto should simply be unity matters. Any institution needs unity. Imagine if a political party allowed a dissenting faction to stay, to bed down. It would collapse. Yes, the church is different from a secular organization, but there is overlap. We need a sort of institutional realism that remembers this. This is partly realism that the majority view has authority and has the right to exert that authority. It's not virtuous to renounce the right to exert that authority, because then you get paralysis and schism. In a sense, there's a duty to exert that authority. It sounds a bit polemical, but the traditionalists don't seem to believe in the Church of England as an entity that should be taken seriously in this way. The same is true of the evangelicals over LLF right now. For them, principle or conscience comes before the need to keep the church united by a single structure. They respond that we should have a looser Church of England in order to stop it from fully breaking apart. Now, evangelicals have never put that much emphasis on the idea of a united institutional church in the first place, perhaps, but for the Anglo-Catholic traditionalists, there's a more obvious contradiction, as I hinted earlier. They elevate the idea of unity with Catholics and Orthodox, as Rose was referring to, as a replacement for the actual unity of the Church of England. For example, Philip North, was researching when he was appointed to Sheffield, he said that his grounds for opposing the ordination of women was his belief in the unity and authority of the Church. I don't think he means the Church of England. It's assumed to be just a worldly jumble of traditions, a sort of stage on which one can perform one's principled attachment to true Christianity, however you define that. Its unity is not something to be taken seriously. And probably for a lot of us, maybe if we come from more liberal theological backgrounds, it is a bit of a jump to think, well, maybe unity, a sort of high ecclesiology, really do matter in a sense that we maybe grew up slightly rebelling against or assuming that that wasn't really that important. So in a sense, it's about learning that it's sort of fallen into our court, in a sense, and that we have to go with it and sort of take control of that aspect of theology. So this disdain for the unity of the church is something, unfortunately, that church policy has allowed. The Declaration enables this or even encourages it. It doesn't affirm the ideal of the unity of the Church of England, which is a bit bizarre, really, for church policy not to prioritize that. Instead, in I think the second half of the 5 guiding principles, it uses the Anglican communion as a way of justifying disunity. Because there are different opinions in the wider communion, it is right for them to be protected in the Church of England. Rather oddly, the Church of England is then the only province of the Anglican communion that has this low opinion of itself that thinks its own unity does not fully matter. I said before that we need institutional realism, but in a sense we also need institutional idealism. This particular church needs unity and authority in order to cohere. Its unity matters, and therefore it must be defended against those who don't seem to believe in it. Thank you very much.
Yeah, if you choose. Thank you so much, Theo. It's really, really given us a lot to think about there. Questions? Has anyone got any questions for Theo? Yes. Do you want to come up? It might be easier if you haven't written it down.
Thank you, Leo. I just want to ask my understanding, and I'm not a historian, of the equality legislation. Is that it has Christian origins in terms of what has been described, no male, no female, no all the rest. And so, although we might be accused of falling back to secular values, it's Christian values actually, and we need to reclaim that territory, I think. That's not really a question, I suppose, but I wondered if you had a thought on it.
Thank you. I kind of agree. That, the principle of equality, in fact, I wrote a whole book about this, our secular values come from Christian origins. I very much agree, that this is the basis of our, semi-secular liberal values, are Christian. But it's really a question of tactics, of how to present oneself. So I think to appeal to equalities legislation and say this must apply to us is not quite the right approach, because I think the priority is to have a coherent religious account of who we are and what we want that doesn't seem to be reaching for help from the secular law. And of course it's a delicate balance, and of course sometimes we do need to use secular law, and it's right to do so and to find the links with the church. But I think the main point is that if one makes too much of that, one will be pigeonholed for one's motivation not being sufficiently religious. Simple as that.
Thank you. Next question says, the press doesn't seem to be interested. Any thoughts, re how to raise awareness?
Yeah, it's an important question. I touched on it, that it's not a very sexy story, really, compared to the split over homosexuality in the church. But of course it is tied in, as we said. Basically it's the same ecclesial issue emerging in both things of division and structures. I think the way to get more attention is just to be bolder, and it's quite difficult to decide how to do that. But we need to be more honest that we do want to see a united episcopate. We do want to see the end of special provision for the traditionalists. And as I said, there's a sort of aggressive side to that. Well, it is quite a bold thing to do, and we have to think about how to present that, but not shy away from it. So clarity really is the way forward, and also trying to find ways of getting attention and saying that, you know, this is crucial for the survival of the Church of England, that we have wrongly allowed this kind of poison, I suppose is a strong word, but maybe a necessary one, of division being justified, and an institution can't survive. It's just going to disintegrate unless there's this new emphasis on unity, and unfortunately for some, that will mean the end of their particular provisions.
Thank you. I think also it's interesting, it's important to note that a lot of people think that this is just going to fizzle out. There are a few dinosaurs left and, you know, whatever, this is fizzling out. But every year we are ordaining more men who either don't accept women as priests or as church leaders, both on the traditionalist Anglo-Catholic side and on the conservative evangelical side. So there are a lot of young men being ordained with their whole careers ahead of them, and teaching this theology. And I went into a Church of England school recently, was told, I was teaching a sixth form class, one of the boys said, you know, women need to be under the authority of men. My church teaches that. Yeah? There were, sorry. Okay, we've got some more questions here. Hang on a second. But, you know, so it's dangerous. This theology it's not just an abstract argument. Okay, so another question, sorry. Why have we allowed a conservative group to identify as traditionalists? That's a good question.
Well, it's just semantics, really. I mean, you know, we have to choose some word to use for this faction or group. Obviously, all the terms are flawed, but I think we know what we mean by it.
Okay, I'm a bit overwhelmed with questions here, but here's another one. Do we need to distinguish between unity and uniformity in this debate?
No, I think the Church of England has this huge tradition of having unity with a lot of flexibility involved, and of course it's almost come apart for centuries, but it's somehow managed to keep, as far as I know, it managed to keep its bishops formally, structurally united all those years until 1993. But, it's famously a broad church, which means that you can have different ideas about, how to dress in church and what to believe about the virgin birth and so on and so on and so on. And nevertheless, you didn't fall out, you didn't start setting up an alternative church within a church with different bishops over these things. You learned to rub along with each other. And of course, there is already a division, and it has been, growing up for years and years of basically the evangelicals are pretty much sort of separate already, even if they don't get the divisions. But it's important to rein that in and to not formally allow it.
Thank you. I think we've got a question here, which is really probably for me, which is, but we cannot stop those young men getting ordained. Surely that makes us as bad as them by denying their call. What I would say to that is their call really to the Church of England, which has female priests? And that is for them to discern, really. Because if it's not, then they're probably not being called to this church if our church is a church that now ordains people to all orders of ministry without reference to gender. So that's what I would say to that. I think we've got time for one more. This one says, thank you for your important thought leadership. How can a national church justify putting bishops who represent us into the legislature, into the House of Lords?
Well, that's a slightly different matter, isn't it, about whether any sort of bishop should be in the House of Lords, I think, or is that tied in with the...
Well,
right. Yeah. 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 Yeah, it's obviously a contradiction. I mean, the law does say that there's exemptions for exactly this, but it still sits a bit oddly with the broader tradition of the Church of England, which, as I see it, has a rather unique link with liberal culture and the liberal state, liberal politics, and so on. And of course, that's complicated, and there's always going to be issues of tension. But the basic sort of plot of the Church of England, as I see it, is that it has a very positive view of liberal politics and liberal culture, and that is obviously called into question by the current situation. And it does mean the end of a sort of benign form of establishment, as I see it, if that deepens or continues.
Thank you. It's actually quite a good question to finish on for this session, because in fact I think our next speaker is going to be picking up some of those issues. So we are now going to, let's give a last round of applause to Theo.